at the Boston University's Pardee Center for the Study of the Long-Range Future. Janot is passionate about helping people use science to better understand and manage the climate risks. He work with Her work has shown how communities can turn challenges into opportunities for resilience and sustainable development. Sustainable development. Today, she will share some of her most inspiring experience from around the world and demonstrate how humanitarian efforts are helping people prepare for uncertain future with hope, innovation, and determination. Please join me. Welcome John Mandela de Suarez. Hi.
Thank you so
Okay, you get the floor.
I'm trying to put it in presenter view. Here we are. There we are. Thank you so much, Yao, for a lovely introduction. So I'm actually going to start with a question. What on earth is anticipatory action, and how is it making humanitarian work, humanitarian efforts around the world more effective? To be provocational, as a humanitarian worker, looking at the current state of humanity on this planet, I could say that the humanitarian sector is failing. We are seeing more people at risk from increasingly severe disasters. However, there is a big change underway that gives me tremendous hope, and that's what I would like to explain to you, because I think this is the invisible side of our humanitarian work around the world. So what you're looking at here, the photograph was taken in Mongolia, and it's the first responders with Mongolian Red Cross, Red Crescent, and they are not responding to a disaster. They are responding to a forecast. They are anticipating the forecast of a dzud. Does anybody know what a dzud is? Show me your hand if you do. A dzud is a cold snap. It's an extreme cold snap. And because of the changing climate, these extreme cold conditions have been responsible in recent years for tremendous losses of livestock, sheep, goats, cattle, yaks, horses. So I'm going to share with you my work both as a humanitarian, and also I've had the privilege of being a policy advisor and a technical advisor on disaster risk finance and insurance as a consultant to the World Bank in many of the countries where I also support the humanitarian sector through the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and other humanitarian agencies. So in today's world, to be effective, our humanitarian operations increasingly need to be what I'm going to call climate smart. The truth is that the planet is heating, and there is such an excess of increased greenhouse gas emissions going into the atmosphere like a blanket around the Earth, trapping solar radiation so not as much can escape back into space, that no matter what we do to reduce the causes of a changing climate, it is going to continue to change. And the Earth is going to continue getting hotter before we can stabilize it. What this means in the humanitarian world is that we have work to do. You may recall 2003, we had extraordinary European heat wave. Our climate science has advanced to the point where we can now calculate what scientists call excess deaths, more deaths that are attributed to the excess heat caused by a changing climate. Now, what you're looking at is a post that was made by a member of the French Weather Service. It was actually in 2019, but with the experience from 2003, when almost 70,000 excess deaths occurred, 2005, again, 2017, again. In 2019, only 2,500 excess deaths were reported. We thought we were doing better. What this French scientist noticed, looking at the heat map for Europe in 2017, what he says in French is, I have never seen what I see on the meteorological maps. And he noticed that it looked very much like the painting, which has now become somewhat famous, of a Norwegian painter named Edvard Munch, which is entitled The Scream. And that's the painting that he's posted next to the European heat map. Those extremely dark areas indicating extreme heat were unprecedented at that time. I am very sorry to have to share with you that in 2023, again, in a European heat wave, close to 60,000 excess deaths were recorded. So how do we define climate risk? We use a simple formula. The hazard, and there are many climate hazards, and the exposure. Exposure refers to people, their property, assets, infrastructure, and also our livelihoods. So these are just some statistics to share with you. How hazards are changing over the last 10 years, the number of people affected over the last 10 years, as well as the estimated cost of damages in a majority of the world's countries, all increasing. Don't know why. Sorry, I don't know why I'm having trouble advancing my slides. This has not happened. There we are. Okay. So what I'd like to talk with you about this afternoon is my experience with the Red Cross Red Crescent in what we started calling early warning, early action. Why early warning, early action? Because an early warning is only as good as the action that it triggers. I'm also going to introduce to you a concept called forecast-based financing and why we need this. But most of the talk is really about the development of anticipatory action and how it can make our humanitarian work more effective. I worked for over a decade in West Africa, and the picture you see, I'm very proud of. In the country of Togo, one of the smallest and one of the poorest countries in the world, experiencing extreme impacts of a changing climate, primarily with flooding, but also with drought. Government could not afford to install hydrometeorological weather prediction tools and instruments all over the country. But they did have 60,000 Red Cross volunteers. And one thing that Red Cross is very good at is training. So we thought, why not train the disaster management teams in all these communities along the rivers to be the observers? You see, a trained Red Cross volunteer was trained by the National Hydraulic Service, and he's reading a river gauge. So he's recording the river level, and he's going to SMS it into a database. We also trained Red Cross volunteers to read rainfall gauges. So I've explained to you why we talk about early warning and early action. It's because the climate is changing. We are experiencing already more extreme and more frequent severe weather events all over the planet. What this means is that risks are increasing. This changing climate is affecting both human systems and natural systems, the environment that we depend on for our livelihoods and our well-being. What we are discovering, what we're keenly aware of in the humanitarian sector, is that these impacts have been differentially affecting the most vulnerable. The impacts are generally experienced earlier, and they are generally greater for people who are disadvantaged. In addition, disasters can create enormous setbacks for national development. In 2026, this is Jagan Chapgain, who's the Secretary General and the CEO of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. He was at a meeting of G7 ministers, and he called to continue the dialogue on how can we reduce demand on the humanitarian system and the related necessary financial aid through better timing of what he referred to as very limited humanitarian supply. And he made the point, it's early action that makes early warning work. That is how we save lives. Early action enables us to anticipate using early warnings so that we can avoid some risks, so that we can reduce those risks that we cannot prevent, and so that we can prepare for continually changing risks. To be effective, early warning has to enable early action. And early action is successful when it saves lives, reduces suffering, and it can also help us by reducing economic losses and protecting development gains. Early warning uses data, it uses technology, and it uses science. And the methodology that we are using in the humanitarian world is to assess risk and plan action based on risk assessments. So here's a question for you. When Typhoon Tembin hit in 2017, here is 75-year-old Maulana Malune. She was one of the elders from a village called Panganan in the Matigsalug tribe, one of many indigenous groups from Mindanao in the Philippines. She was only able to salvage her necklace and a few items of clothing in the flooding that washed away their homes and their livelihoods along this river where her people, the Matasalag people, had always lived, and they were forced to relocate to an area inland. An increasingly, unfortunately, common situation for people living on the coasts, whether the coasts of rivers or lakes or the ocean. So, thinking through how do we translate early warning into early action, we have a basic set of questions that we have to answer. We need climate and disaster risk workers to collaborate from the local level to the national scale, and they need to agree in order to have coordinated operations. Who should be part of decision-making as well as taking action? What warning information is available? And what warning information is appropriate for the hazard and the local context? What actions should the warning information trigger? You have to develop a plan. When will the actions be taken? How do you know when the level of risk requires mobilizing? And who is responsible for taking actions at all of these levels, from national to provincial to local? Here's another great example from the Pacific. The EAR-Watch, the Early Action Rainfall Watch, was issued by the Climate Center, my team based in The Hague, but we have members of the team around the world, with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, based in Geneva in Switzerland. So the national Red Cross societies receive these rainfall watch monthly forecast bulletins that show the status of rainfall with alert levels and a rainfall outlook that includes the level of action that the forecast should trigger. So then what happens? The Red Cross consults with their National Weather Service, their hydrometeorological service, and with the National Disaster Management Agency. And then the national and community level preparedness actions are triggered when the danger level is reached. And here we see some women in the Marshall Islands who are engaged in community outreach for drought. And you can bet that they are encouraging people to collect rainwater to prepare for an expected drought. Now, not always do things go as planned. I thought it would be good to share with you one of the first major lessons that we learned with my team going way back to 2007, where we were promoting early warning, early action. In 2007, there were tremendous West African floods. We had very expensive response. All of the West African countries that were affected, their ability to respond to the floods was beyond what they could afford. They made requests to the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent in Geneva, to the Disaster Response Emergency Fund. When they made these appeals, the flooding had already happened. It took months for the money to come to respond to the disaster. And we thought, we can do better. The next year, we happened to have an intern. She was a West African student at Columbia University in the Climate and Society program, and she had a summer internship in the West Africa office of the IFRC, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, in Dakar, in West Africa. And she saw the seasonal forecast come in, predicting, once again in 2008, huge flooding over the next 3 months in several locations in West Africa. And she said, we can plan ahead. Let's put in a request for funding support to take early action. This was the first time that the Disaster Relief Emergency Fund had been used to take action before a flood happened on the basis of a seasonal forecast. It was in the wake of tremendous floods in 2007. So in 2008, when this request was received in Geneva, they said, yes, we will process this and we will send the funds. Well, it still took about 8 weeks for the funds to be processed. Meanwhile, the flooding began, but already many actions were accelerated. So the response to the flooding was tremendously accelerated. Honestly, we were not able to take any action before the flooding began, but the response was tremendously improved. What happened? 2009, seasonal forecast came into the West Africa office. The head of disaster management said, I know what to do, put together a plan with all the funding, identifying where each country that was going to be affected according to this seasonal forecast for extreme flooding, where the actions that could be taken exceeded their existing capacity, how much money would be needed to request from the Disaster Relief Emergency Fund, and he sent it off to Geneva. Well, when they received it in Geneva, what was the response? They said, what? You don't expect us to do this every year, do you? And they did not approve the money. The flooding happened as predicted, and the response money was requested after the flooding happened. So we actually had a setback after our first success. Another thing that we have learned is that we can use climate information across timescales. So for that West Africa flooding, we were using seasonal forecasts. The seasonal forecasts tell us what we can anticipate over the coming 3 months. But we can also, of course, use short-term forecasts, days, weeks, and we can use warnings and alerts that might be a matter of minutes in the case of some things like earthquakes and hours. We also need to be keeping in mind those longer-term climate projections. The climate projections are what can we be expecting over the course of years and decades. Generally, we say the difference between weather and climate. The weather is what is happening now. The climate is what's happening over a period of 30 years or more. So some examples of the kinds of interventions that we can take before a disaster happens at different time scales include what we call WASH, which is water and sanitation interventions. We can also deploy emergency response units to assist. In the case of imminent disaster, we send experts in different sectors ahead of the disaster. before the transportation and communications become difficult. We can also do pre-emergency water purification distributions, preparing for flood where clean water is likely to be affected. We can plan for safe water access for the most vulnerable. We can plan for potentially erratic seasons. Unusual variability is one of the trickiest effects of the changing climate that we can use forecasts to cope with. We can also plan for increasing water stress over time. Because of global warming, water tends to evaporate. Water resource systems are living systems, and they may not be as productive over time. They're not providing the quality as well as the quantity of water that people need for their basic needs. This requires investment in solutions, we say, at the landscape scale. It's at the scale of the water resource system to ensure future availability is sustained. We can also improve water use efficiency and how we manage the entire watershed as well as our groundwater aquifers, using long-term projections to prepare for droughts in the future. All of this means building capacity of local institutions and communities to understand their water systems, improve their water use efficiency, and also their ability to store water. Now, over the last 20 years, we have developed within the Red Cross what we're currently calling a climate action journey. So from the national to the local level, as well as from the local to the national level, we need to coordinate a lot of different actions. We need national climate risk assessments to understand the changing risks, the impacts, both currently and in the future. We need to do this, we need climate smart screenings. We need to look across all sectors. How is transportation affected? When are communities not accessible? How are communications affected? If, for example, cell phone networks blow down, are there agreements in place so that other networks will carry the calls if there are disruptions? Climate smart plans, programs, operations are a lot of risk assessment and then a lot of planning for coordination, for integration into existing work, but also integration of people in different agencies and working in different sectors. So what we really need are multi-year climate strategies. And we are doing this incrementally, working with National Red Cross societies to identify their priorities in terms of sectors, their partners, national partners, community level partners, and their specific vulnerabilities, the profile of the communities. Community engagement is at the core of everything we do in the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. It's the power of people, strengthening capacity to undertake the assessments on an increasingly regular basis, participating in these processes to ensure that we're building on local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, and also that we are informing local risk perceptions and capturing ideas for local solutions that go into the way that we design programs for what we're calling locally led adaptation to a changing climate. These programs need to develop in a way that is inclusive as well as strategic to adapt to a changing climate. And for implementation, the key is To what extent can it be locally led without waiting for outside assistance to arrive to undertake smart climate action, implementing local solutions, and for the full process to be risk informed, using the best available science and information. So we're doing all this great work on climate risk assessment, action planning. What's the problem? This cartoon was drawn by Paul Biska, one of my World Bank colleagues, who moonlights as a cartoonist. And it makes us laugh, but really, this is the core of our problem. Nobody wants to spend money for a disaster that hasn't happened. Here in Massachusetts, I often say, no one wants to be the governor who calls out the snow plows, and then we only get a dusting of snow. We don't want to spend that money because we're afraid of acting in vain. So how are we approaching this problem? We're calling it forecast-based financing. That doesn't mean that forecasts bring money. It means that to ensure humanitarian action before a disaster strikes, we need to pre-program the money. And that's a different way of working. We actually undertook a very rigorously researched study that we called The Cost of Doing Nothing. So we looked at the humanitarian price of climate change and how we can avoid it. And I can share with you this figure that we used, looking at the increase in populations in need of humanitarian assistance due to climate-related disasters that is projected from 2030 to 2050, comparing to 2018 in blue, the projection increase in people affected for 2030 in orange and for 2050 in green. So nearly twice the estimated 108 million people who need help today from international humanitarian system. This is because of floods, storms, droughts, and wildfires. Looking at this is the reality of our future. So forecast-based financing, we define as an approach for catalyzing humanitarian action based on extreme weather and climate forecasts. We have published, we've used a lot of econometrics and formulas to demonstrate rigorously the way that we can reduce financial risk by using forecasts as the triggers to release dedicated financing. So it's not saying just release the financing to implement an action plan. It's saying let's define a risk level or a danger level that can trigger the release of the financing to mobilize the action plan. This is our innovation. Why do we do this? Because forecast-based financing beats response. We have to stop chasing disasters. We can't wait until the disaster happens to then count up all the damages, put together the requests, the funding requests to respond. We need to improve the performance of our outcomes. We want fewer total crises. So we want to prevent those crises that we can avoid. We also want more efficient performance. So we want to be spending less money per crisis, but also less money per person affected. We want to improve the efficiency of our humanitarian operations. We also require more flexibility in a volatile environment. So we may need to have the ability to put, for example, more money into non-flood related work in some regions of the world or in some seasons. So we need both seasonal and geographic flexibility within the humanitarian sector. And we also want to increase the performance of our team. We want to be continually building capacity, including for results when we have less anxiety within our teams because we are using better science to anticipate risks and to formulate action plans. We have greater clarity and predictability, and overall performance improves. Now, I wanted to play a little game with you. This is a voiceover game. So we have in front of us a typical scenario about science and forecasts. What do these icons represent? Well, the first one, it's a partly sunny day. And then what happens next? Well, the exclamation point in the triangle, like you see on the road that people put out when there's as a warning, there's a forecast of a thunderstorm, of heavy rain coming. And then the heavy rain comes. And then the sun comes out. And then there's another forecast of heavy rain. So the soundtrack is the game. We could say that these icons tell a story. Partly sunny day, I have some little musical notes, people going for a walk, maybe whistling a tune, maybe humming a little song. They hear about the forecast on the radio, and this maybe gets their attention. Then the rains come, and they say, sun comes out again, back to singing the happy song. The next forecast comes out on the radio, and they say, whatever. There's got to be a better way. I'm going to show you 2 more soundtracks, and we can use words, but I'm going to ask you to turn on your microphones, and to help me to make a soundtrack, we can use sounds to make our own special effects, and let's see if we can tell a different story. So the first story is the usual surprise. So what's happening here with the first one? I can tell you from playing this game before, some people are humming a little tune. And then they say, whoa, whoo, there's a forecast. And then the rain comes and they say, oh no. And then the flooding comes and they're saying, help, help. And then here come the humanitarians with their response money. They say, we're coming, we're coming. But unfortunately, the usual scenario is they're coming with too little and they're coming too late. What would be a different story that we could tell? Now, this forecast-based financing innovation, let's see if we can tell this story. We start with a warning. Flood warning. What happens? When we have forecast-based financing in place, there's a flood warning. Immediately, here comes the humanitarian. They've got a plan. So this could be the local Red Cross disaster response team. They have a flood prevention plan, and they also have the money they need to fuel up those vehicles and to pre-position that equipment and to take those actions that they've planned to prepare before the flood hits. Here comes the flood. We can add a little soundtrack. We have the plan, which means standard operating procedures. Fewer people impacted. We managed to get people out of harm's way. Flood's coming. We got the warning. We mobilized. And then at the end of the story, we've got the humanitarians coming. They don't need as much money for the response because there are fewer people impacted, and we've reduced the ways in which they have been impacted. Yay! So this question of how do we allocate always limited humanitarian resources when there's no early action, we need a lot of money for response, and there's a lot of suffering. When we use funding triggered by a forecast to take early action, we spend a little bit of money on preparedness. We spend less on response. Sometimes, yes, we may act in vain. We may spend money on, let's say, pre-positioning equipment that we didn't actually need to use because the impacts weren't as great as anticipated. But on the whole, we are using our limited amount of funding more efficiently than just responding the way we did in the past. And most importantly, we're able to reduce the suffering, the human suffering. So this is the big step forward, that forecast-based financing is assisting us. We're trying to turn a big ship. So we have pioneer countries from 2013 to 2019. I was involved in projects from Bangladesh to Ethiopia, Peru, Tanzania, Togo, and Uganda. We are also applying this methodology across a diversity of hazards, not just floods and droughts, but also, remember, the Mongolian Dzud, the cold snaps, which they also are very serious in the Andes, up in Peru for livestock, cyclones, monsoons, the specific hazard impacts are very different in megacities and the urban environment. We're working on all of these different scenarios. We're also working on a policy level. So the Netherlands Parliament, the German BMZ is the German Development Agency, former White House, DFID is the UK Department for International Development, and also in the United Nations system, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and in the Bretton Woods system, the World Bank Group. And we are also working in different ways involving artists and creatives. Why? Because we have discovered that we need to communicate science more effectively. We can't have scientists speaking scientific language to the great general public. We are also advancing on the research front with universities from what we call the North and the South around the world collaborating. And this forecast-based financing approach is being integrated into many, many different levels of humanitarian systems. From International Disaster Relief Emergency Fund to individual hydroelectric dams, building it into their policies, and different agencies working in the humanitarian sector. So in the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, we had a policy statement in 2020 with a focus on early warning, early action, and forecast-based financing. And it also spoke about connecting the last mile in early warning systems. reaching this all people, including the most vulnerable in all communities, including the most remote. So this is a big challenge to us. We need to change our language and our practice to put what has traditionally been referred to as the last mile. We need to be putting that first and calling it the first mile. We need to be collaborating with national government always. The Red Cross and Red Crescent is unique in that it is always established by statute, by law, as auxiliary to government. However, it is also by statute a neutral party, apolitical, not involved in any politics, because we help people on all sides. We don't take sides. We provide assistance where assistance is needed. So early warning, early action is gradually becoming part of preparedness planning for almost every country around the world today through their national disaster management strategies. And usually the national authorities, this would be the weather services, the hydrometeorological services, and other alerting authorities, are usually mandated to lead and to engage other actors in early warning and early action. This is a huge step forward that we're very proud of. On the governance front, national societies of Red Cross and Red Crescent are now supporting their governments, not just in disaster management, but also with their climate commitments. This is for those of you who may be familiar with the International Framework Convention on Climate Change, their annual talks. The Paris Agreement in 2015 was a milestone when 195 countries signed an agreement, including adaptation to climate as a central pillar to help the world's most vulnerable, and the development of national adaptation plans in all countries, but especially in the less developed countries, is gradually including input from the humanitarian sector, from national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, and others representing the most vulnerable, so that those voices are included in national plans to adapt to a changing climate. So the role of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement has been evolving, supporting national level preparedness, developing early warning systems, improving early warning systems, supporting this new approach of forecast-based financing mechanisms, also supporting community level early warning systems that are actually implemented by the local communities themselves. Cooperation and coordination with weather services and disaster management agencies, continually improving, and our collective advocacy for early warning and early action is making some great strides. So what we now call anticipatory action is reflected in the United Nations Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. This is a quote from the framework: to substantially increase the availability of and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information and assessments to all people by 2030. We've set timetables and targets for action. So anticipatory action is now an important part of climate as well as disaster risk management, and the role of Red Cross as auxiliary to government for national to local anticipatory action is changing. Locally led advocacy is increasing. The goal of early warnings reaching all people at risk means the systems need to be in place and the services need to reach that last mile, which we call our first mile. all of this is a result of over 20 years of increasingly effective disaster risk reduction and response planning and action. We are also working at the regional level, and I wanted to share with you, I'm not going to go into all of the detail that you see on the slides, but with support from the World Bank, we have been supporting the development and implementation of a regional roadmap in the Caribbean, starting in the Caribbean region, but there are reasons for harmonizing efforts across countries in a region. There are cascading benefits when you strengthen a regional system, and it helps tremendously to leverage funding towards a joint goal. And some of the cross-cutting principles that inform this regional strategy is that early warning systems need to be people-centered. They need to provide services. We need to be expanding early warning systems to create multi-hazard early warning systems. Increasingly, people are not experiencing a single hazard. There are cascading and compounding hazards. So intense rainfall may lead to flooding. Flooding may lead to landslides. We need to capture all of these. So there's a concept that we're working towards of the system of the future, which would be multi-hazard, impact-based early warning systems. Why impact-based? Well, for this regional model to be inclusive and reliable, we need to know what are the impacts of the hazards. And those early warning systems need to provide services that anticipate impacts in order to protect lives, to protect livelihoods, and to build resilience in a changing climate. So this process is ongoing in the Caribbean. The World Bank, the World Meteorological Organization, and the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Agency are all collaborating globally in an initiative that we call Early Warning for All. So in the Caribbean, we began to outline what a regional rollout would require. A phased approach with actions, anticipatory actions in the short term, the medium term, and the long term, with the financing teed up to enable all those actions to proceed in a coordinated and planned way. We need to create the enabling environment by harmonizing policy across countries. And we need to be building capacity that is sustainable, which means involving not only communities, but looking across different sectors, identifying vulnerabilities, and most importantly, engaging the private sector. So this idea of impact-based forecasting is changing the way that we approach disaster risk management and climate risk management. It is essentially a shift from forecasting what will the weather be. What we're more interested in is what will the weather do. We need to be working across what we call the 4 pillars of disaster risk management. That's risk knowledge, understanding the risk. We gain that through monitoring and forecasting. We communicate it through early warning, and we need to be increasingly sophisticated with how we communicate. And we want that early warning. We want a response to the warning that translates into action. Action across sectors, action for business continuity, and action at the community level for the protection of people, their property, their assets, and their livelihoods. So in the Caribbean, this regional goal, which is really our global goal, is to have an anticipatory action plan in every community within 5 years. And what is important is to initiate the process of action planning using the best available forecast information. It's not about having the perfect plan. It's about starting with a plan that is linked to a forecast, carrying it out, and learning by doing as we go forward. So I'm going to conclude here with a look at where are we with anticipatory action? What is it achieving? We are making better and better use of available scientific as well as local, which could be traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, risk information from all sources and at all time scales. We are also getting better and better at dedicating funding so that it is available at the time that it is needed to mobilize action plans. If we have a hurricane forecast that a hurricane is going to hit in 3 days or 3 hours, that is not the moment to be scratching our heads and coming up with an action plan. We want to use every minute of those 3 days to be pre-positioning equipment, moving people out of harm's way, protecting livestock, protecting our communication systems, maybe protecting our energy systems, doing everything we can to reduce the impacts of an anticipated hazard. So this idea of taking appropriate humanitarian action before a disaster is working. We are applying it now on a large scale to food security and also to prevent health emergencies. So I like this little cartoon, which essentially is showing us the cycle that we've been trapped in of chasing disasters, where a disaster happens and then we respond and then we recover and then we repeat. Anticipatory action is enabling us to get ahead of disasters for the first time. It's enabling us to break out of the cycle of always being too little, too late. So to conclude, I'm just going to share with you some of the evolution of this concept of forecast-based financing, or linking the necessary financing to anticipatory action. It goes back to 1999 in the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, where we had the first preparedness policy articulated at the international level and translated into national action planning with national Red Cross Red Crescent societies around the world. We began to capture some good practices in early warning that were published in 2006. In 2009, the World Disasters Report, which has a different theme every year. In 2009, the focus was on early warning, early action. We considered that to be a huge step forward. In 2016, the World Humanitarian Summit. At that summit, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent made a pledge to support forecast-based financing. Remember the story I told you going back to 2008, 8 years previously? They didn't think it was such a great idea to be funding it all the time. It's a complete change. 2015, an international multilateral fund, many wealthy governments, coming together to create the Climate Risk Early Warning Systems Multilateral Fund. One of the initial investments was helping the 17 or 18 countries of the Caribbean region to develop that regional strategy for multi-hazard early warning, early action that I shared with you. In 2018, a new fund for forecast-based action was created by the IFRC in Geneva, dedicated financing for early action. In 2019, something called the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership it was actually led by France, but it was at a UN Climate Action Summit. And this early action partnership links climate, development, humanitarian, and the weather prediction communities to get ahead of disasters, and provides funding for national initiatives around the world. In 2020, with support from the German government, the Anticipation Hub was founded. It now includes 170 partners across humanitarian, development, and climate sectors, all working on scaling up anticipatory action around the world. In 2022, as I mentioned, the United Nations announced the Early Warnings for All initiative, with the goal that every person on Earth should be safeguarded with access to appropriate early warning systems by 2027. Coming up soon. Are we going to make that goal? Probably not, but we are making a lot of progress. In 2024, United Nations Office for Humanitarian Assistance, they, for the first time, systematically mainstreamed scaling up anticipatory action. Today, they are providing through their emergency relief fund. Let's see, last year it reached over 124 million, supporting 25 national anticipatory action frameworks, protecting 5.6 million people across 20 countries. And recently this year, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has created a new financing facility for shock-driven food crises. And that is not only enabling, it's ensuring early targeted interventions before a crisis happens to protect the food security of the most vulnerable around the world. So I want to thank you for your time, for your interest in this work, and my work, my continuing work, I would say is dedicated to the contributions of my husband, Pablo Suarez. Here we are. Can anybody recognize where we are? This is at Boston's Museum of Science in 2024. He was responsible for coming up with the concept of forecast-based financing and has been recognized last year by the Global Meeting of the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Agency at its annual conference in Geneva. The World Bank's Global Facility for Financing Disaster Risk Reduction has a global forum called Understanding Risk. And next year, it will be dedicating a one-day symposium called Risk Resonance that will be dedicated to Pablo Suarez in recognition of his tremendous contributions making climate and disaster risk management not only more efficient and more effective, but also finding the fun that even in the most dire circumstances, the power of humanity is truly that working together, we can find joy and succeed together in even the most difficult challenges. Thank you.
Thank you.
I welcome any questions you may have.
I have a question. To prevent, to protect, to prevent, that means you are not going to be accurate all the time.
Exactly.
So consequently, the cost-wise is that know the increase the cost compared to the saving you can have for the after the disaster.
Yeah. So I can answer this in two ways. The World Bank is not the only organization that has done this, but with the World Bank, we have done some economic studies to understand the value of taking early action. And it depends on how you're counting. But we could say that for every dollar spent on early action, we are saving $7. There are other studies that say that we're saving $20, but it is, from an economic point of view, enough studies have now been conducted in different regions of the world and using similar but locally tailored criteria that we can very firmly assert that spending before saves money. It's a more efficient use of limited funds. The other way that we can look at it is in terms of the decision making. So one of the reasons that my work involves a lot of games, humor. I mean, I work with cartoonists. I will do anything to try to communicate science because I can be very good at putting people to sleep, talking about science and talking about the methodologies. But I know that you're an engineer and maybe some of your friends and colleagues are also engineers. I could show you how we run our code. So we look at, like in Togo, we did a country national risk assessment where with climate scientists, we did backcasting. We looked at forecasts over the last 20 years, and we looked at the correlation between the forecast and what actually happened. And then I ran a workshop with the National Red Cross Society, and I said, okay, under this scenario, forecast by forecast, under this forecast scenario, at what point would you, let's say, at what percentage of probability let's say we're talking about flooding, so for extreme rainfall. If there's 20% probability of extreme rainfall under this forecast, would you mobilize action? Would you start spending money? Would you start fueling up those, vehicles? The answer probably was no at 20%. At 50%, would you initiate action? Making the decision of what level of probability of risk is going to be the trigger to mobilize an action plan is a very important part of the process. And it's that appetite for risk. So sometimes it has to do with reputational risk. I'm spending somebody else's money, and I don't want to be blamed for spending it in vain. So we start to layer This is terminology that we teach in the World Bank when we're working with national governments. We want to layer our financing. So we want to think about what are the low regret and no regret actions, and where should that money come from? So maybe those no regrets, low regrets actions, they might come from contingency funds. I build into my annual budget a 10% contingency, or, we figure out what contingency we need. So I have this flexibility in spending, but it's only for those low regret, no regret. So let's say, maybe it's flood forecast. So we mobilize teams to go clean all the drains so that they don't clog up and back up and flood communities. It's not something that we're going to do every day. We're not going to be sending out, the troops to clean all the drains in St. Lucia every day, but we can define a level of forecast probability that we think, and it could be 50%, it could be 60%, it could be 80% probability, but it's going to be those disaster managers who are responsible for their own budget who decide, when am I going to spend that contingency to take that action? Then there are more expensive actions. There are national level financing that we might want to cover with insurance. So there has been tremendous growth in the development of regional risk pools. There's the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. And the Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, it covered initially just earthquakes. Remember the big earthquake in Haiti? The first money they received, within 2 weeks, within 14 days, they had a payout from the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. Now, because Haiti was very poor, the payout was woefully inadequate, tiny. But the timing adds value. They waited months for other money to come into the country to respond to the earthquake. So that first money coming within 14 days was so valuable because it enabled them to save lives and reduce suffering much more rapidly. But today, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility has discovered, for example, if countries can take out a hurricane insurance policy, they're paying for one hurricane event. But we know, NOAA puts out a forecast every year of how many might be anticipated. I actually don't know what it is for this season, but it could be 12 named storms and maybe 4 or 5 at a category 5 or category 4 or 5 or higher. And this predictive information is improving dramatically all the time. It gives us a better way of programming our financing because we have more information upon which to assign the dollar value of our appetite for spending to reduce risk. A good example would be, the hurricane in Jamaica. So there's a very interesting story here. In the beginning of the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, the big problem is how to get all the countries to pay in. The way the principle of insurance works is, ideally, everyone pays in. And if everyone is paying in, it enables you to bring the cost down for everyone. But if only a few countries are paying in, that's going to put the cost of the premium, it's going to hold it up. So that you start a new regional risk pool, you're trying to bring everybody in So Jamaica had a hurricane policy, but 5 years went by, no hurricane. Jamaica is kind of outside of the main hurricane track. It's Cuba, Haiti, the Bahamas, that get hit almost every year. And that, Eastern Caribbean is more where the hurricane tracks run more frequently. So what did Jamaica do? They said, this insurance, it's so expensive. We need healthcare systems, we need roads, we need schools, we need, communication, we need everything. So they said, we're going to drop that hurricane policy. They dropped it. And so the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, this is really concerning. You have to hold on to your clients. So they scratched their heads and they were thinking, we've got to find a way to incentivize letting countries stay in. So they did two things that are very, very innovative in the insurance industry. They decided when a country insures for one hurricane, they will do a second payout if you have a second storm as an incentive. And that's great, especially, for countries that after 2017, where they had multiple Category 5s ripping through the Caribbean, hitting this country also, that mechanism was in place where countries could get a second payout when they were hit by the second hurricane. And good incentive to keep buying that policy. But the CRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, they did a second very innovative thing. So they were offering, by this point, multiple products. They're offering hurricane, which is generally tied to wind speed, but then extreme rainfall is also a problem. So they're offering extreme rainfall products. They also started testing in several countries, offering livelihood insurance, interruption of business insurance. And the innovation that they introduced was, let's say with rainfall, you experience extreme rainfall, but it didn't hit the threshold that triggers the insurance payout. It's below the attachment point. So the CRIF said, if you experience an event below the attachment point, below the threshold that your policy has paid for, we will give you a payout. It will be a percentage based on how much below the attachment point it is. So you still get a payout. And that has proven to be a very smart innovation in keeping countries paying for their products every year, because it removes that concern that, well, what if I get all kinds of extreme rainstorms, but none of them are extreme enough to get that insurance payout? That's some of the ways that we're finding working the financing to both be profitable for the insurance industry to stay in business while payouts are increasing in frequency and number around the world. So the insurance industry has to figure out, how to stay in business as more and more people are at risk from more and more perils and hazards. But the price of insuring against them, it has to be, viable for the industry to stay in business. So this, it's a fascinating kind of new area of work for me. And I'm doing a lot of work right now looking at how to use what we call parametric insurance. So within the insurance industry, there are two ways of protecting. You can do payouts for verified damages. So let's say, a hurricane comes through When the hurricane is over, the insurance adjusters go through and they tally up, what are all the damages? And they come up with how much of whatever you're insured against are we going to pay out to you? Are you going to get a full payout or a partial payout? Well, parametric insurance operates differently. Parametric insurance is the payout happens when a pre-agreed, scientifically determined threshold has been reached. So let's say for hurricane, for extreme wind, if 175 miles per hour is what triggers the payout, it's as soon as that, that 175 miles per hour is confirmed by a National Weather Service or National Hurricane Center in Miami, all the countries that are affected, they get that payout within 24 hours. And that is, as I mentioned, the timing of the payout is extremely value adding, makes it more valuable. The sooner you get it, the sooner you get that liquidity. So the use of parametric insurance is something which is discussed a lot at the level of reinsurance, the companies that insure national insurance companies. The national insurance companies are only beginning to learn about how these products operate. Rainfall insurance is increasingly being used in the agriculture sector. And it's great for farmers because if they don't get enough rain, if they're insured against drought, they know that they need a certain amount of rain by a certain date for a certain crop to germinate. If they don't get that rain, that crop is already failed. And at that moment, the failure of rain to fall triggers an immediate payout if they have a parametric insurance policy, rainfall insurance. And that enables the farmer to recoup their losses however they want to do it. They may invest in buying seed to plant a different drought-resilient crop. They may be able to just feed their family for that year or pay their labor. It's up to them how they use their payout. But this new application of parametric insurance is very interesting in the context of early warning, early action, of anticipatory action linked to forecast-based financing. So what we're working on now, and a lot of my conversations are with so this new food security program that World Food Program has in place has been developed in conversation with some of the big reinsurance companies. And what they're looking at is using the same weather forecasting, the same hydro-meteorological thresholds. In other words, the technical definition of a danger level, of an observed danger level, triggers not only the action plan, it also triggers an insurance payout. And it doesn't have to be an insurance payout. It could trigger a payout of money, however you want to layer the financing for a national anticipatory action plan. There might be some big things that a sovereign national level insurance policy would cover that could be taken out with a regional risk pool, like the Southeast Asia disaster risk insurance facility, new facility, Southeast Asia, the CDRIF, or the Caribbean one, the CRIF. And on the African continent, there is now this Africa Risk Capacity facility that I don't know if all 54 countries are using it, but probably 30 or at least 30 or 40 countries are using this. Originally, it was just drought insurance. And then it expanded, just like in the Caribbean, it expanded, offering flood insurance, extreme rainfall, many different kinds of products that enable countries to anticipate and get liquidity that they need before a disaster develops, because the payouts are parametric. So the payouts are not based on assessment of damages. They're based on achieving a predefined hydrometeorological danger level. Now, there's some very interesting work that has been done in the United Nations system. My climate center team, I've led assessment teams evaluating some of these new approaches that have been used, for example, for food security protection in places like Ethiopia. We did an assessment for the United Nations Office of Humanitarian Affairs, and they look not only at the weather predictions, they're also looking at market prices. So for food security, it's not just a function of what the farmers can or can't grow, of the weather conditions for agriculture. It's also very much, food security is determined by market conditions. So we see this now, reported all over the place as a consequence of the war and the problems with transport through the Strait of Hormuz and not receiving fertilizer. It's having these repercussions where it's not just that the farmers can't get the fertilizer to grow, it's that the prices are spiking and people can't afford their basic needs. So the financing instruments that we're developing today are increasingly sophisticated, still very much grounded in the climate risk, in the observable, verifiable scientific forecasts and monitoring, but also now looking at market conditions. And one of the smartest early warning systems that the U.S. Agency for International Development invested in developing is called FuseNet. It's a famine early warning system that over 30 countries across the north of Africa, I think even maybe some in Southern Africa, have been using, combines hydrometeorological forecasting, weather forecasting, rainfall forecasting with market forecasting. It's just brilliant. So when the U.S. Agency for International Development was dismantled, when Elon Musk said he was going to throw it in the wood chipper, the first thing I did is I went to the FuseNet website and it had gone dark. And I was beside myself. I was calling everybody I knew, NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. We had our hearts in our throats. We couldn't believe that this brilliant, as a humanitarian practitioner and even, as a climate advisor, of course, I was criticizing FuseNet all the time, but we have to criticize it to improve it. And it was the best thing, that had ever been, implemented on this planet and was being used crucially. I'm happy to say that the State Department has reopened the FuseNet system. It is functioning once again, thank goodness. But we have so much potential right now And another exciting thing I'd like to share with you is, we talk about the sort of double-edged sword of artificial intelligence that, okay, it's great, but it requires, so much energy in these data centers and, maybe for, in terms of the climate, it's using so much energy. Maybe it's actually, working at cross purposes. Well, I can't tell you, for all the different applications, but I do know that for forecasting, using AI it has opened a new generation of forecasting because already the best forecast approach that we have been using is what we call an ensemble approach. So we use many different forecasting methodologies. This means that different agencies, it could be, the European Space Agency, it could be NASA, but we can use each of their forecasting models, which have different levels of skill for different parts of the world. But when we put them together with others, with Japan's, with whoever, when we put them together in an ensemble, it improves our overall ability to forecast. And AI is dramatically already improving our ability to do ensemble forecasting. And here's the interesting thing. Using AI for ensemble weather forecasting and climate risk forecasting actually uses less energy than our traditional computing ensemble forecasting. So it's not all it's not all bad.
Are you responsible for, you're responsible for a whole world or for an area? How do you define that and how you, because I'm thinking if you are doing the whole world, that's it. Of course, it's going to be much more effective to
Yeah.
be prepared for. But
So I should explain maybe a little of how we work in the humanitarian sector. Um,
yeah,
so uh, I mean the when I worked for the Global Environment Facility, I was in the international water. I was the knowledge manager for the international waters portfolio. So I was responsible for knowledge sharing between, there were always 65 to 75 multi-country projects. Projects could be 2 countries or it could be 15 countries. And that was all funded by national government contributions to every 4 years, the Global Environment Facility has a replenishment. And they spend about 4 billion every 4 years. And it's spent across all of the Rio conventions. It's spent on biodiversity, it's spent on climate, it's spent on water, it's spent on land degradation. But in the humanitarian sector, the first level of operations are locally funded. So when we talk about, a national Red Cross society, they're all joined at the hip with their national disaster management agency, but they have very different roles from one country to another. So the International Federation it's like a network of members. The members are all the different national societies, but the International Federation functions as a knowledge management network. So it enables, let's say, in some tiny Caribbean country like Haiti, with its reputation for problems on every level, but they're actually doing something very, very interesting. They have youth that are driving the development of local early warning, early action plans. How do they do that? How do they mobilize, kids under 25 to discipline themselves, to, put plans in place and to carry them out? And that kind of learning from each other is one of the great strengths of the Red Cross, Red Crescent system. But for those of you who aren't that familiar with it, there are two sides to the Red Cross, Red Crescent system. So there's the Federation that does this great knowledge sharing, and it also does global advocacy. So it has this disaster relief emergency fund, and it has this new fund for forecast-based action, dedicated for forecast-based action before a disaster hits, which is a radical innovation. It's dedicated to spending money before a disaster hits. But in order for that money to be spent, the way it works now is that those national societies have to have come up with an early action protocol. To do the early action protocol, you might remember the complicated slide I showed you that had about 10 steps, or it was 7 steps, but it starts with a national climate risk assessment. And then there's the identification of the priority hazards and the priority impacts. And that action plan has a budget, so every single action is budgeted. And the national society has to look at what can they carry out using their own regular annual budget. What do they need to advocate to maybe government, or, it's actually different in every country. Some of them have community-based organizations or, different ways of funding their work. But they all now have this opportunity when the needs exceed locally available financing for low probability, high impact events. You have to meet certain criteria. It's not for flooding that happens every week. It would be for a hurricane that you don't know if it's going to happen this year or next year, or it's going to happen once or twice or 3 times a season. So for the low probability, high impact events, they can write an early action protocol, an action plan, defining the thresholds and the triggers for action, what the budget required is, and then they submit that to the Disaster Relief Emergency Fund in Geneva, where their plan is evaluated. And when it is, and there might be a little bit of back and forth, when it is accepted, it's like a standing order. And that standing order is triggered as soon as the forecast happens. Let's say, it's for a hurricane, and the hurricane starts forming out in the Atlantic, usually 2 or 3 weeks before it gets to the Caribbean. And let's say, watching a storm track, and all of a sudden a tropical storm hits a predetermined threshold, a danger level that is defined in, let's say, one of the Eastern Caribbean countries. It could be St. Kitts and Nevis, and they've defined this trigger for their early action protocol to prepare for the very likely hurricane, very likely to hit them. We all know hurricanes can change track at the last minute, but they've defined the probability of a hit. And when they cross that mutually agreed threshold, the payout is within 24 hours. So they immediately are deploying all those local teams to, maybe they're taking out contracts with people who have chainsaws and trucks, so that after the storm, they're ready to start clearing the roads immediately. Maybe they're pre-positioning relief supplies. Maybe they're going door to door and they're relocating people who are in particularly fragile housing, or they're working with people with disabilities who can't easily evacuate later, so they have a priority status for early action, different part of the action plan. So all of these things are linking the same triggers for the action plan to the release of timely funding.
It's very interesting. So we have a question from Lily Tao. Lily, are you still here? Her question is, since USA withdraw the Paris Climate Agreement, does the government help finance your great effort?
Well, I can tell you my personal story. I had started climate action journeys in the two most vulnerable Caribbean countries, Dominica and Antigua and Barbuda. Both of those countries were hit with two Category 5 hurricanes within 30 days, twice in 2017. And in Antigua and Barbuda, the island of Barbuda was completely evacuated. I've worked in the Red Cross building on Barbuda. It no longer exists. Almost every structure on Barbuda was destroyed by the hurricane or swept away. And the majority of the population, they relocated to the mainland or to other parts of the Caribbean or other parts of the world, have not recovered. And the island of Barbuda, it has not yet recovered, from 2017. Everything was destroyed. It's also one of their biggest tourism areas, enormous environmental damage to the beautiful mangroves and bird, aviaries and environment. But the Antiguan Red Cross had been working on this concept of forecast-based financing, and they had in place a brilliant new mechanism. So there's a national registry, a social protection registry, like a welfare system. So the government knows who the most vulnerable people are. And within this registry, the Red Cross had issued, it's like a credit card that you can use in an ATM. And they were able to load those credit cards because people, they're evacuated. They had to leave their home. Their homes were all destroyed. And we don't know where they are. They're staying with friends. They're staying with family. They were able to immediately load those.
儿子喜欢的 style，你的跟我的是一样的。儿子喜欢的 style，宽宽。眼镜的是吧？对，
Yeah. Anyway, so sorry, I don't speak Chinese. But anyway, so in Antigua Barbuda, Red Cross was able to follow the most vulnerable people who had been evacuated and provide them. So they were able to go to the grocery store and buy food. They were able to go and buy new, shoes or clothing, whatever they need, for their families, for their children. They were able to, get their kids back into school and, to cope. So these are all things that were inspired by this idea of forecast-based financing, that we can see the immediate benefit, was working in that context. In Dominica, the Red Cross has a tremendous membership and respect for traditional knowledge. It's one of the countries in the Caribbean where the indigenous people were not all exterminated. It's actually because of the topography. The jungle and the steepness is so complex that, you know, when the European settlers came, it was too difficult to get into Dominica. So they called it the nature island, and they kind of left it alone, which protected, you know, the indigenous people. But they, you know, they carry a tremendous historical knowledge, climate knowledge. And I mean, it's everything from, you know, medicinal to, you know, how to build homes that can withstand, you know, winds and floods and all kinds of things. So the climate action journeys were originally funded by Japan, by JICA, to start them. And we held big meetings. We had, in Dominica, we had planning, we had disaster management, all coming to Red Cross, you know, government agencies. We had women's groups. We had all these different, you know, groups and government agencies coming together to start this process of climate risk assessment and national action planning. In Antigua and Barbuda, where they're so much more sophisticated on the financing front, they had this idea that they wanted to work with national government, with their weather service to define the triggers, with their disaster management agency. They were going to do a joint early action protocol for hurricane, and they were going to define which actions are carried out by government and which actions are covered out by Red Cross. At what level do they start to, at what level of implementation of the action plan do they exceed available local funding? And the idea was the Red Cross would create its early action protocol that it would submit to the International Federation, to Geneva, for hurricanes. So they would have this standing order for financing, for a hurricane action plan, for all the work that would exceed their local budget capacity. And then disaster management was going to go to cabinet and say, look, here's the joint plan that we've done. Red Cross is taking care of this part, and they've got this disaster risk emergency fund in Geneva that's going to cover the excess that they can't afford. We have our plan. This is how much we can do with our annual budget. And this is the excess that we need government to guarantee so that our whole national plan works. Brilliant idea, leveraging co-financing, basically. And we had started this whole process, and January was going to be our next, that we were going to start up again. I had to delay. We were working in November. We used up the Japanese money, and USAID was going to fund the next phase under their new locally led adaptation program. Well, January, what was it? I think it was January 23rd, I got a stop work order. Everybody did. We had a global portfolio with the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Center with USAID. We had never been funded by USAID before. And we had started the work in the Caribbean, supported by JICA, by Japan. And USAID said, stop work. So I thought, oh, well, we'll just wait a little bit. Well, then we all learned they pulled back all the money, and we could not recover. We still haven't been able to recover the financing. So in Dominica and in Antigua and Barbuda, they have been able to move forward a little bit on their own, but our technical support, we have not yet been able to replace that USAID commitment, because it wasn't just for the two tiny Caribbean countries. It was a global portfolio in many countries, working in, you know, Lebanon and Bangladesh and around the world, some African countries. So a lot of my work over the last 20 years has been funded by AFD, the Agence Française de Développement, French government development agency. Enormous amount has been funded by the Netherlands Foreign Affairs. And the Netherlands Foreign Affairs, for 8 years, they funded what we called Partners for Resilience programming in several regions of the world. And they funded my work in West Africa and also in the Caribbean for 8 years with Foreign Affairs as a partner, which was wonderful, very unusual. We also had early forecast-based financing work funded by the German government, and they funded the first 2 pilots. One was in Togo that I was in charge of in West Africa, and one was in Uganda that my colleagues were running. So we were learning from each other, doing one in East Africa, one in West Africa. And extraordinary, German government, they funded 6-year projects, unheard of to have a project so long. But what that enabled was it allowed us to encounter what otherwise would have been insurmountable challenges. I mean, I think the project would have failed if we hadn't had 6 years to confront the challenges. The biggest challenges were our methodologies are all science-driven. So we're looking for data. And we discovered, like in Togo, I go to the National Weather Service, and for 2 years, they would not share their information with me. And eventually, we had developed enough of a trusting relationship that they said, well, look, the reason we don't want to share it with you, they were telling me that it was hadn't been digitized. I said, okay, let's get some university students to build databases for you. We'll fund them, we'll give them internships and let them do it. You tell us the criteria, you tell us what we want, and we'll make this happen. And they wouldn't do it. Well, they wouldn't do it because they said, we know that the data that we have is useless. We can't even clean it. They said, we know that some of our rainfall observers are basically doing this. So we realized, okay, so we have to start fresh. We have to start new time series. And if I hadn't had, I mean, I went to Berlin and I met with German Red Cross and I told them, you know, our whole methodology, we don't have the foundations. We don't have the data foundations. The Weather Service doesn't have the rainfall information. The Hydraulic Service, they don't have the river level information. And even the UN agencies and the Red Cross didn't have the disaster information, the impacts. So we couldn't do backcasting, looking at past disasters. What are the impacts? What, you know, how are people affected? So I said, look, you know, I've only got one opportunity to go forward. And we had talked with the hydro dam, big binational hydro dam. And they were interested in improved forecasting for producing hydropower. And they were not using any information from their National Weather Service. They were paying their own rainfall observers. They were paying 8 observers in the upper watershed. And we said, look, we can put together models for you, you know, using ECMWF, using these satellite-driven, you know, models to give you a proxy forecast so that you know how much water is coming down that river and is going to hit that reservoir so that you can manage making releases and producing hydropower more efficiently. And they loved that idea. But it took 2 years for them to also even talk with me. The first time I went to the dam, they see me coming with a great big guy from German Red Cross, and they say, oh, you know, 2 international people, they're going to accuse us of causing flooding deaths. And it was true. When I started working in Togo, 25 people a year were dying from flooding because farmers, they knew it was going to flood their fields, but they didn't know when. So they would be sleeping in their fields and they would literally die for an armload of corn. because the flooding usually came in the night when they'd be sleeping in the fields. Sleeping in the fields so they could get that, whatever they could carry would be their only harvest. I mean, it was just so tragic. But I am proud to say, since 2015, when we started collaborating with the hydro dam and we developed these very innovative machine learning proxy rainfall models and flood prediction models, there has not been a single flood death in that river basin. So we have saved lives, but I would say the even more extraordinary story in Togo is that for many reasons, the government wanted to take over the flood prediction model that we had established. And we got some World Bank money to get this little model running. But it was run out on a server outside of Togo. And Togo government, they said, no, we want it to be ours. We want it on our servers. They actually won the World Government Innovation Prize in Dubai in, I don't know, 2016 for this flood prediction model. It was so innovative. But they were unable to transfer it onto their own servers, and they didn't have the technical capacity to keep the servers running. So the whole thing stopped functioning at the end of our project. And they still have not been able to get that thing running again. However, the collaboration between the dam and the Red Cross, so the local disaster managers, the little Red Cross teams, these are people who live in all these little tiny farming communities in the river basin, they understand the meaning of the data. So they have a WhatsApp group, and in the rainy season, the director of the dam is not allowed to make flood forecasts, under government. The official forecasts can only come from the National Weather Service. The National Weather Service doesn't have the capacity to forecast floods. So the workaround is the dam will announce in the WhatsApp group, the water level in the reservoir at 6 a.m. this morning was 137, and it's raining upstream. And so all the Red Cross disaster managers, they know that 144 is the maximum level above sea level. If it gets close to 144, the dam is going to have to start making releases. And those releases are going to flood downstream communities. So they're on alert. But then the dam gives them a second data point. And so the dam will say, but electric production is at 250 meters cubed per second. Well, today, all those Red Cross people, they know that the dam is capable of increasing flow through the turbines to produce hydropower. They're capable of increasing up to 700 cubic meters per second. So there's a big sigh of relief. Yes, water level is high, but production level is only 250. They can increase up to 700 without causing flooding. So big sigh of relief. They understand this. We would never have been even able to conceive of proposing a project to build the capacity in hundreds of little villages in Togo to understand the relationship between those two data points as the basis for an early warning system. But that is, I would say, the most astonishing result of that 6 years of work developing an early warning system with a hydro dam in Togo.
Wow. This is really interesting. It's a mingle of technology, finance, policies, all together, right?
It's all together. And
Yeah.
mean, we use these funny terms like, you know, enabling environment. Well, I mean, you know, who is going to maintain these early warning systems? National government has to maintain them. And if you have a weather service, like in the Caribbean, if you have a weather service, you know, that has 3 to 5 employees, and their work days are full, just producing daily and weekly forecasts or 10-day forecasts, they don't have the time in the day to do an impact-based forecast. They absolutely would love to. They absolutely have gone to the training workshops. They understand how to do it, but they do not have the physical time. And government can't afford to hire more people in these tiny little countries. And if they need to collaborate with their water resources department, it's the same thing. Maybe there's one guy working or one woman working in water resources. I mean, to ask them to develop an early warning system, it's not that they don't know how to do it, don't want to do it. It's that they don't have the physical time or capacity to be able to do it.
Yeah. So how do you protect the future of this work?
Well, I mean, this goes back to one of those pictures that I showed you. Remember where I mentioned there was a guy with a Red Cross vest in a dugout canoe next to a river pole in the river. He was taking the reading. He was taking the 6 a.m. reading. So that's an extraordinary example of the power of humanity. In Togo, government could not afford to hire more people. Their number one goal for the weather service is to keep the airport open. And in the majority of countries around the world, that is the number one priority. It's running the airports is what the money that government puts into a weather service is. That's the priority. We might think it's disaster management and protecting people and doing forecasts. No, it's actually not. And they protect that staff and that ability to keep those airports open. They have to. I mean, this is just the reality, you know. But as a humanitarian, I guess, 10, 15 years ago, when I started realizing what the actual barriers are, it was very frustrating. You can't assume that humanitarian objectives are a top priority. And the money flows for humanitarian work are minuscule, in the big picture, the global economy. But we have to do the best with what we have. And this example in Togo of, the government couldn't afford to put rainfall gauges, and they couldn't afford to pay the observers. This is why the hydro dam, the national hydro dam owned by the government, was paying its own rainfall observers because the Weather Service couldn't provide the service that they needed to protect their dam. And we were able to bring in Dutch money to buy, and German money, and then some French money over a period of years to buy lots of rainfall gauges and to set them up and down the big river basins. And we collaborated with government to have the Weather Service train Red Cross volunteers to read the rainfall gauges. But we funded the work, and we used Fab Lab, we used Togo young people, university students working on hardware, software, who designed an API system so that we could SMS the rainfall and river level readings over cell phones directly into a database. So So, and the World Bank funded, they gave us like $50,000 to create the API and to set up that little database and make that system function. The Red Cross they want to add more information that could make a more sophisticated flood prediction model. They want to record when river levels make flood roads. So they want to record, for every community, the moment when floods make them inaccessible. They want to record the moment when floods flood homes. They want to record the moment when floods flood fields. So those are the three priorities for the Red Cross for protecting people and their property and their livelihoods. Government is not able to manage that. So the capacity is there. The government has now trained 1,500 or more Red Cross volunteers to be rainfall gauge and river gauge observers. They read them and they SMS the data in. They're not paid to do that. They do it because they recognize the value for themselves in being able, in collaborating with their weather service and their natural resources department, the hydraulic department. But they are expecting improved early warning systems. And we're not seeing the progress on the improved early warning systems because there are much more complex issues that have to do with policy and have to do with business models.
Could you comment on how the Chinese government is handling this kind of problem?
Well, I can tell you that so I left the Global Environment Facility, I think in 2008, and I started working with Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. But already at that point, China was using satellite-driven precision irrigation for agriculture. I mean, extremely advanced. And honestly, the capacity of China for mobilizing local action, because I haven't worked with Red Cross Red Crescent in China, I can't give you a firsthand view. I can only say from an armchair view that I think it is vastly underappreciated. So when I give you an example from Togo, one of the tiniest and poorest countries in the world, with what Red Cross volunteers can do to find innovative ways with a little bit of support from the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, from people like us in the Climate Center, helping them to put their own functional warning systems in place that are smart, that are science-based, that are data-driven, under the most limiting conditions. And these are not people who have access to higher education. When you look at China, I would say we're waiting to see what China can unleash. We're waiting for the greatness.
It's interesting.
I was told something very interesting by a former environment minister. He was brilliant. He was one of the first writers about circular economy. Unfortunately, his writings have largely been scrubbed from the internet, and he was forced to resign because there was a chemical spill in a big river that he was responsible for. But I remember he was where was he? I can't remember. I think it was at Princeton or somewhere. I met him, and he told me China has the smallest resource per capita ratio of any country in the world. And for this reason, China must build strong, long-term relationships around the world. China needs reliable, robust supply chains. They need resources to flow into China.
Mm.
So China is, from my perspective, very interested in stability and in strong long-term relationships for that reason.
We have a Red Cross.
Yes. And I have not worked with the Chinese Red Cross, so I don't know much about them. It's a very good question, and I should have thought of that to research a little bit to be able
They
to.
are independent of.
Yeah.
Are all the Red Cross independent unit, or you like your own particular range, or it's a hierarchy, it's national, it's worldwide?
There's no hierarchy in Red Cross national societies. The federation is it's an open network of national societies.
Mhm.
The only criteria is that they always must be established by national government, by statute. They must uphold the fundamental principles of humanity, unity, transparency, neutrality, and that's what enables the. I didn't explain really the two sides of the Red Cross, but the International Committee of the Red Cross works in conflict zones. So the committee is more of a technical team who I also work with, and the International Committee of the Red Cross has, over the last decade, become increasingly interested in integrating climate risk into all of their operations. So we've actually worked it's usually on a country by country basis with the International Committee doing climate risk screenings. So I've worked on climate risk screenings in places like Lebanon, Mali, Haiti, Burkina Faso, in countries that are in conflict.
How about the U.S.? Like all the technology U.S. has, are
Well,
you able to take advantage of?
so American Red Cross has funded a global center for disaster protection, and they have they've made some contributions in technologies like mobile apps that can be installed on phones to make access to warning information more accessible to the most vulnerable. And the Red Cross societies in the wealthier countries often support projects and programs in developing countries. So I was supported by American Red Cross. I did a training with Vietnam Red Cross, teaching Vietnam Red Cross how to use games for disaster risk decision-making awareness. It was great.
Interesting.
And I think, as I mentioned, German Red Cross, Dutch Red Cross, and French Red Cross have funded a lot of my work in the Caribbean and in West Africa.
Thank you so much. Is anyone else has anything you want to ask questions? I guess, do you have anything?
他录音是德贵的，因为他正在录制，现在没关系的，他是要录等一下专题的。
就是你在听别的时候。Okay, thanks so much. I think it's
Thank you so
we
much.
learn a lot. I think so complex.
It's lovely to have the opportunity to share the work that, really I feel is a privilege to have been able to be part of. And I hope it gives you some hope for
This
humanity.
is eye-opening to see different world doing a different things. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for. We'll see you next time.
正在录音，你们就不要讲。